I'm Travis. I'm making a retro-style survival horror game based on classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill called The Revanchist. For the last week or so, I've been working on building up new enemies for this game from scratch. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to talk a little bit about what was wrong with the old ones, why it was worth throwing them away to make new ones, and what I specifically did different this time to make these new ones even better than the old ones ever could have been. That being said, word of warning, this is not going to be like my normal videos. I like to do things scripted and well edited. This is not going to be that. Because you see, I just got monetized, and now I've got memberships. And I think this could be a fantastic opportunity to do something a little bit different than I normally do. A way to talk about things a little more in depth than I could in my normal videos. So I want to do this one live, in-engine, as I show you guys the things that I'm talking about. But I'll be explaining that a little more at the end. So if that sounds up your alley, stick around. And if not, don't worry, most of my content is actually good, so go check out this instead. Either way, let's get into it. Okay, so why don't we start by taking a look at the old enemy and seeing what we can improve on. First of all, the walk animation. This animation isn't necessarily terrible, it's not exactly what I want for these enemies, but that's not so much the problem. The problem is that, let's say we put more than one, which is going to be fairly common, these are the standard enemy that's going to make up the bulk of the combat in the game. We're going to pretty quickly notice an issue. All of their movement syncs up perfectly. Not just their pathfinding, but also even the animations will very quickly start to sync up with each other almost one-to-one. As such, if we're going to be fighting multiple enemies that are all chasing you down like this, it's really important that I've got at least a couple of different walk cycles for them, especially for humanoid enemies where you're really going to recognize this kind of thing. It's not going to be quite as important with like a dog or something, you're not quite as perceptive of that, but with a human-like walking animation, it's so obvious immediately. So what I did here is set up a system where I could actually choose an animation set just with this one variable. For example, we've got this guy here. But if I change this anim type to, let's say, 1, instead of doing his normal standard walk, he's going to do this kind of limping, flailing instead. And the way this is done is actually a pretty simple setup, though it is one that I want to improve on in the future, and that is just using a single blend space to choose between which animation set the enemy uses. So that includes everything from idle animations to run animations. And what that means is if I want to have enemies have different walk cycles, all I have to do is copy it over and change this one variable. Now that's all well and good, but you may have noticed there that they actually moved at different speeds. And that's because this variable doesn't just pick which part of the blend space to use, but I also put together this data table which stores a bunch of different information for each animation set, and lets me change anything from their pathfinding to their health to their movement speed, giving you a different experience with each enemy. And what that means is I can actually tie their stats into their animations and give you a bit more of a dynamic gameplay experience where you kind of have to pay attention to things. An enemy who walks more like this is generally going to have much higher health and also move a lot faster, so there's someone you got to make a bit of a higher priority. Whereas this guy over here is not only a lot slower, but also a lot weaker, so he's only going to take a couple of shots to kill. One of the biggest differences, though, is this guy here is generally going to be a little bit easier to hit. He stands more upright and walks in a more direct path towards you. So as soon as you see him, you should start dumping some bullets in as fast as possible so you can take him to the ground before he reaches you. This guy, on the other hand, only takes 3 or 4 shots to kill, but he's hunched way lower and swings left and right a lot more, so you gotta be a little more careful, take some time, line up your shots, and don't waste any bullets in the wall behind him. So that means you kind of have to pay attention to things if you want to be efficient about your gameplay. So one other problem with the old ones is they can make for a pretty boring combat encounter in a long hallway, because all they do is walk straight towards you, so all you've got to do is point down the hall and start pulling the trigger. Not exactly that engaging, and even having multiple enemies really doesn't do anything about that. And even having multiple enemies really isn't going to do anything to help that, because they're just going to follow straight behind each other. So once again, all you really do is point in one spot, start pulling the trigger. It's just not very engaging. It's kind of boring. And so what I've done with the new ones is I've given them a little bit of side-to-side sway when they're walking down a hallway. Not a huge amount, but enough that you can't just point straight down the middle. You do actually have to pay attention and track where they're moving. This little bit of side-to-side sway also does help enemies from getting stuck on each other, because remember, they do have different move speeds, so if a faster one is behind a slower one, that little bit of side-to-side motion helps them slip past around instead of getting caught behind them. And so the way this works is actually with a pretty simple environment query system. All this does is it projects a few points in front of them and runs through a few conditions to weigh up what their best option is. One of those conditions is the point shouldn't be directly between them and the player. It should be a little bit off to the side if possible. Something else I did is add a quick check as to whether or not they can actually reach you or not. So if there's a gap in the nav mesh, such as what I usually put in doors, they're going to get right out of your way instead of sitting there camping in front of the door like they tended to do. Though they might come back and drop by occasionally in front, they're not going to stand and linger, they will get out of there. But why don't we take a second and actually jump in and see how the enemies work, because I'm very proud of what I've done with these. As I mentioned before, I want to make this a versatile enemy that I could use for basically everything in the game, from other enemies to bosses. And so I put a lot of forward thinking into how I programmed it to make sure I've left my options open. And that was one of the biggest reasons that I redid this enemy from scratch, from the ground up one more time. Because this is not the first time I've done it, by the way. This is actually the second time that I've redone this enemy from scratch. This is what the event graph looks like in the previous one. And this isn't even the base enemy, this is just the zombie variant. This is the event graph in the base enemy. There's really not a whole lot going on. There's not a ton of flexibility here, and so everything kind of had to be done on an enemy per enemy basis, and it was really complicated, really messy, and I really didn't know what I was doing. So stuff like the attacks are all hard-coded in this section here. You may have already seen the function that decides whether or not the enemy should lunge. This is kind of a mess, it's a nightmare to understand, and impossible to do anything with nowadays. And it's all completely hard-coded in, so I can't really change any of this on an enemy per enemy basis. And if I want to make a different attack or a different set of conditions, I'm pretty much going to have to do it from scratch, and that's not really going to fly. And the same goes for everything, from the stun and stagger animations to their death. Even the decapitation is specifically programmed just in the zombie enemy and is all hard-coded in. So I really didn't want to do that with the new one. As such, I put a lot of effort into making sure that everything is scalable, modular, and reusable. So even starting off with something as simple as stagger animations, I put together a system where I could dynamically add animations and add conditions for each one. Stuff like how big of a stun or stagger does it have to be, what angle do you have to be hitting them from, and even what body part has to be hit to trigger it. And while we're on that topic, why don't we talk body parts? In the old enemy, it was a really rudimentary and frankly terrible system, where all I did is typed in the name of the bone, how much damage they should take, and how much stagger damage they should take, and whether or not it was a critical hit, so something like the head had that checked off. Once again, there's not a whole lot I can do with that. What I did in this one is actually properly define limbs. So I'm keeping it pretty simple right now, but in the zombie you can see base, which is everything except for the head and the legs, the head, and then the legs. And as you can tell, I've got a lot more options in here than I did before, including dismemberment. So now, unlike the previous zombie enemy, this is completely procedural and dynamic. And I could arbitrarily define any limb on this enemy and have it be blown off just like that. Not only that, you see this little checkbox under the limb data for the head, lethal dismemberment, well, I can uncheck that. And now, so that means I actually have a full-on dismemberment system that I can use. Not only that, but it's also already tied into their attacks. Because for the attacks, I handle them very, very similarly to how I've done the rest of it. I don't want any of it to be hard-coded into the enemy itself, I want it to all be dynamic and modular. And so if we pop into our zombie variant, and look under our attacks section, you'll see that I can actually define each individual attack off of a preset list of data, and then the enemy will dynamically pick the right attack for each situation. I can even define different types of attacks, such as a hit or a grab. And these have a whole bunch of data built in that I really don't need right now, but I want to have it there just in case I need it later, because I want to leave my options open. Stuff like required limbs. Again, the zombies don't have any dismemberment other than the head right now, but if I do want to implement something like that, it's already here. I could just type in which limb is required for each attack, and it already checks, is that limb still there, yes or no, and it'll filter based on that. And that lets me make context-sensitive attacks so much easier than I could before, and it also lets me tweak and adjust them so much easier. Such as the grab, I've actually got 3 different versions. Such as the standard grab, which happens if you're at a close range and you're not moving too far away from them. There's also a fast grab, which takes priority if the player is moving at least a decent speed and is moving more or less directly towards the enemy. And then there's a lunge attack, which is another type of grab. This one gets triggered if the player is at least 220 units away, so that's outside the range of their normal attacks. But it also has a special condition on here, lunge. And that's because I can set overrides or blocks. Anytime it calls an attack, it'll also call a context. And so, in this case, when a lunge is triggered, it calls the attack with the specific context of lunge, meaning it'll find the attack with that context. But I did also set that up to go in reverse. Let's say when I wanted the enemy to lunge, instead of specifically picking that attack, I wanted to exclude a different one. I could do that. All I have to do is go in here and type in lunge. And there you go. If the enemy is trying to lunge, it will refuse to do this attack. So this is 100% overbuilt for what I need right now. The enemy only has a couple of different attacks, and the differences between most of them are really nothing major, it's just timing. But it's really, really nice to have, and it's going to make it so much easier to scale in the future. And yes, you did hear me say grab attack, which is not something the old enemies had. I always figured this is fairly important for this kind of game. It gives a lot more impact to getting hit. It also gives you a second to get your bearings, sort of figure out what's going on, and come up with a plan on how you're going to get out of that situation. And this was actually one of the easiest parts of programming the new enemy. Because if you remember, the game already has a seamless cutscene system, and so all it is when you get grabbed is a seamless cutscene. Literally, it just spawns in a cutscene manager, runs a short little cutscene where you stop and look at the enemy for a second and then back up a little bit, and that's really it. And so hopefully, as you can see, the new enemies are a very big improvement over the old ones in terms of gameplay feel. They're way more interesting, way more dynamic, and a whole lot more fun to fight. Oh, I should probably make headshots kill him again. I think that's probably important. That being said, I think there is one more thing that's probably worth talking about. Yes, I made an enemy manager, a functional combat manager for the game. Think Dead Space, Left 4 Dead, or Alien Isolation, but nowhere near what those games do with it. I'm keeping it simple here. So once again, this is something that I programmed in mostly just for future-proofing. Just in case I want to do anything with it, I want it to already be here and set up and working with the enemies, just so it's ready to go. And right now it only does a few simple things. So first of all, with the old enemies, it was really easy just to get comboed to hell and back. So with these ones, the first thing I did with the combat manager is I added a feature where if one enemy hits you, the others won't for a little while. Now they can all throw attacks freely, but once one lands, all of them are going to back off for at least just a couple of seconds without hitting you, just to give you a second to breathe. So if I get grabbed by this guy and attacked, these ones won't do anything for a little bit. That makes the game a lot more playable when you're up against multiple enemies. But that'd be a pretty easy thing to do without a combat manager. It's really not worth programming something like this just for that. Well, the real reason I wanted it is I wanted to be able to make more crafted combat encounters, where instead of just enemies all acting individually, they can act as a group and each get individual specific roles. Now, I really don't want to go crazy with this. Again, these are zombies, they're not really smart. And I think if they were, that would almost break immersion a little bit. But that doesn't mean I can't do anything to make larger combat encounters a little bit more dynamic and interesting. So one thing this does is it'll keep track of every enemy that's in combat specifically, any of them who are currently fighting against you. And then what it'll do is it'll go through and assign roles. And the roles it assigns are based on what type of combat is currently going on. For now, all I have is typical combat, just sort of a generic blank slate, but I can add more in the future and pick between them dynamically, just based on whichever one I want. So with this sort of standard typical combat plan I've made, first thing it'll do is it'll get all the enemies and set them to a default role. That doesn't mean anything, that's just resetting them back to nothing. Then what it'll do is it'll filter out all of the zombies. So once again, part of that sort of forward thinking is putting in a function where I could separate out each specific type of enemy and have them do different things. And then I put together this function here. It's a little bit of a mess, but the way it works is really simple. Basically, it figures out which enemy is going to get to you first, not just based on distance, but also the speed that the enemies move at. And there's a couple of different check types. So first of all, it'll narrow it down with a simple check, which just checks the distance between you and the enemy, and it'll narrow it down to the closest 5. Then it'll do a much more expensive check where it'll actually pathfind from the enemy to your location to figure out for sure which 3 are going to get to you the soonest. And it sets those as the lead zombies, or the lead enemies. So it'll cycle through this every few seconds and decide dynamically which enemies should be the lead enemies. These are going to be the biggest, most immediate threat to the player. Just for illustration purposes, I've got them illuminated with a red light so you can see which ones are currently picked as the leads. Now this doesn't necessarily do a whole lot, but it does make a couple of differences. Number 1, lead enemies are the only enemies who could lunge. As far as zombies are concerned at least, all of the guys who don't have a light are not capable of lunging, so they can only get me from close range. It's only the lead enemies that I've got to worry about doing that. But the other thing we'll see if we look into their behavior tree is this section here that only the lead enemy gets. And what this means is if they're far away from you, they get to run directly to you instead of walking in that weird wobbly path. And what that means is they end up being a lot more aggressive and chase you down much more persistently than the other enemies. Because as you get farther away, they actually speed up. So you can see the 3 lead enemies are right behind me as I start making my way away from there. The rest of them are trailing pretty far back. And again, this just helps things be a little bit more dynamic and interesting, where instead of just having one clump of enemies chasing you around everywhere you go, they'll actually start breaking off into a few different groups. Either way, after that, if there's still a few more enemies in combat, it'll run a couple of more checks. First, it'll grab the closest 6 zombies, and that's probably going to include the 3 lead zombies. Then it'll narrow it down to the farthest 3 of that 6, which are generally going to be the ones that aren't lead zombies, but not always. And the only reason I did this here instead of just saying if not a lead zombie is because I didn't want this to be a consistent number. I wanted it to sometimes be 3 of them, sometimes it's going to be more or less overlap with the lead enemies. So it's just a little bit more variable. Either way, this will set those enemies to flank. And that's another really simple one. It really doesn't do anything too fancy. All it does is it uses a different environment query to get the enemies to try to go beside you instead of just going straight at you. They're not going to take some big path around the map and try to hide from you or anything like that. They're just going to walk a little bit more to the side. So now for demonstration purposes, I've got flanking enemies highlighted with the red light instead of the lead enemy. So there's that guy here, and as you can see, he's kind of going off to the side. I'm not trying to get them necessarily sneak all the way around and get to you, more so I just want to break up the group, and I want to have the occasional zombie start wandering off a little bit more to the side. And I'd say that just about covers the new enemies. Overall, I'm super excited to have these guys in the game. I'm honestly super proud of what I did here. Because when I started this project, I didn't know what I was doing at all. Make no mistake, I made a door that opens and closes, and that was a legitimate achievement for me. I didn't know how to do that, and I really had to learn how. So I was starting pretty much from nothing, and now I've got some not amazing, but fun little enemies to fight at the very least. And by the way, thank you very much for watching, and if you like this video, if this kind of content's up your alley, consider membership, because this is the kind of thing that I want to do a little bit more of. And in fact, next time, I actually want to take you through the process of making these enemies, because I did actually record all of it. I don't really know how to do live recordings. I left my PC audio on, so it's full of copyrighted music. Right now, to choose an animation, this is going to be used, so I am going to have to redub over it. So I'm going to be kind of trickling those out over the next little while, but if you want to sort of see the problem solving, the thought process, and the decision making that went into actually creating these enemies, stick around for that. I will also be talking about it a little bit in one of my normal devlogs, just sort of in my normal style, so you won't be missing out entirely if you don't. And if you didn't like this, please do let me know. I'm still kind of trying to dial in exactly what I want to do as far as member content. I don't really know, except for it has to be fairly quick. I can't spend a whole ton of time making these, because I can't have it take away from development time or what I put into just the rest of this channel. But I did see in making this that I do actually already have a couple of members, which is actually fantastic. Thank you so much. I don't actually know how to check who it is right now. If I could find out, I'm going to throw it up on screen here. But legitimately, the entire development budget for this game so far is about $200. All the software I had is software that I bought a long time ago. I lost a few of those with my old hard drive, unfortunately. Most of the cost was just making the Steam page, which was like $130 Canadian. Other than that, I got about $70 in this thing. So trust me, even a few bucks every here and there really does help. So with all that being said, thank you very much for watching. And as always, have a fantastic rest of your day. And I swear to God, if you skip one fucking ad on my channel, I will be showing up at your door. And so help me God, I will not be coming empty-handed.